Happy Easter! Give glory to God today because we are able to celebrate the risen Savior, Jesus Christ, some 2,000 years ago, rose from the dead this very morning. Me and Kaylee, I'm recording this on Friday, so I guess I have to speak in future tense. So me and Kaylee will be waking up just before dawn Sunday morning, and we're going to be reading through the gospel account of Mary coming to the tomb and just what that whole moment must have been like to start putting these pieces together, that everything that Jesus had said, all these promises he made, were really coming true. The promises in the Old Testament were coming to fulfillment through this risen Savior. So, truly, happy Easter. I hope you and your family are having a great day today, and I hope y'all are going to spend some time really celebrating Jesus and what he has done for us. If you've got your Bibles, we are beginning our series on 1st and 2nd Samuel. This is going to quickly bleed into 1st and 2nd Kings and touching on 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because if you're familiar with the Old Testament, the majority of what happens in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is also in 1st and 2nd Kings, primarily 2nd Kings. So we don't have to really dive into the Chronicles like we will 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So I've got so much to go through today, so let's just go ahead and get started. We are going to be working through the first 7 chapters. You heard me right, 7 chapters of the book of Samuel. Why we're doing this is because 1st and Samuel are not 2 separate books. In the original manuscripts, it's pretty evident even from literary features within the 2 books that this is one book that was eventually separated into 2. So when we speak of 1st and 2nd Samuel, we're not really talking about 2 different books. We're talking about one coherent message. And then this message is really tied into 1st and 2nd Kings. So you've got to study these, what we would say are 4 books altogether. Because what it is showing is it's showing the rise of the monarchy within Israel. And why that's so important is because it has to do with David. And David is this king chosen by God to lead Israel. And because of that, Israel finds a lot of blessing in it. Naturally, because humans are involved, there's also a lot of drama. A lot of people failing, a lot of people not living up to what God called them to be. So I know this is going to sound like a lot, but there's going to come, we're dividing today's class up into 3 different sections, and in these 3 different sections, I'm asking you to read about 2 chapters each time. So today's class may go a little bit longer, maybe not the video, but simply because you're going to have to be doing a little bit more reading. If you do not have the time this morning to do all of the reading, I would really, really, really recommend you do this reading throughout the week. So to begin with, like I'm saying, 1st and 2nd Samuel is really one coherent unit. So what I'm going to put in the description of this video is what's called a chiasm. A chiasm shows, it's a literary feature. It's going to show how things at the beginning of a story will mirror things at the end of the story. And if you'll look by looking at the chiasm in the description, but you'll see that so the very beginning of the story mirrors the very end of the story, and you'll see different things mirror each other as you work towards the middle of the book and away from the middle of the book. But then the very middle of the book will be this one major point that the author is wanting to emphasize. And so it's really cool. I pulled this chiasm from a commentary from Peter Leithart on 1st and 2nd Samuel called A Son to Me. Anyway, so it's not mine. I didn't make it up. It's by Peter Leithart. So what we're going to do today is give a little bit of an overview of what 1st and 2nd Samuel are, as well as work in these 7 chapters. So we've got a lot to do. So right from the get-go, you have a very bleak opening. It mentions this man, how he has 2 wives, but it ends by saying, but this one wife, Hannah, was barren. She's unable to bear any children. You go further on in the story, and the Ark of the Covenant is captured. You go on a little bit further, and Eli, who was the high priest, and his sons are both die. You have the Mosaic tabernacle in Shiloh destroyed. You have all this. It's a horrible opening to any type of book because it's just one bad thing after another. And that's what the book of Samuel really wants to set you up for, is that they were living in dark days. The first the beginning part of First Samuel can be read in light of the Judges period. They overlap. It's not so much we finished Judges and Ruth and then First Samuel begins. There is a pretty big overlap, which we're going to see a really big overlap with Samuel and Samson here in a little bit. There's a really weird ending to Second Samuel. And in fact, I'm just going to stop saying First and Second Samuel when I don't need to. I'm just going to say the Book of Samuel. So the Book of Samuel ends really weird. If you look to Second Samuel chapter 24, it's got a really weird ending where the whole Book of Samuel ends with David buying this threshing floor, and you're like, well, that's what a way to end a book. After all this drama, all this the fight between Saul and David, and all this amazing things happen. That's how the book ends. Well, it actually makes a lot more sense in light of the Book of Kings, where as you read through Kings, Solomon actually builds the temple on that threshing floor. So that's why we can say that Samuel is directly tied into the Book of Kings. You're meant to read the Book of Samuel and be like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next, and then you read the Kings, and all these different features start to make sense. Leadership is really highlighted, and it's seen as it's definitive in how sons and daughters will grow up, and the character they will have, and it's going to show how nations rise and fall, and all of those things are dependent upon leadership. And so it just goes to show that we need good leadership in our lives. We need good leadership in our nation. We need good leadership in our church. We need good leadership in our homes. First and Second Samuel cover about a period of 150 years. You have 40 years of Philistine oppression, 30 years as Samuel starts to grow old, 40 years for each of Saul's reign and David's reign. And the story opens up during this 40-year oppression from the Philistines, which is mentioned in Judges chapter 13, verse 1. So there's already our overlap happening. And like I mentioned earlier, Samuel and Samson have a pretty big overlap too. So this is what I'm going to try to make sense of here. Assuming Samson's lifespan straddled the Battle of Aphek, which we're going to read in today's reading, and the Battle of Ebenezer, which is going to happen next week, as depicted by him being born into Philistine rule. So Judges 13:1 and 14:4 kind of show that period he's being born in during this Philistine rule, and not living to see them defeated. So even though he destroys the temple of Dagon in his account in Judges, that's not when the Philistines were destroyed. So he doesn't live to see this nation destroyed. He's alive during their rule. But that destruction of Dagon's temple was definitely a big blow. So Samson and Samuel would have actually been born and have grown up pretty much in the exact same time period, which is really cool to think about. And so maybe that gives us enough of a really brief overview of where the book of Samuel is to start getting into it. So if you want to take a little bit of time, I think that would be great, and read chapters 1, verse 1 through chapters 2, verse 11. And once you get done reading that, we can get into this story of Hannah. So it opens up on her being barren. And barren was significant to the Israelites because it was through the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15 that the head of the serpent was to be crushed. So all of Israel knew that some person was going to be born to the Israelites that would eventually destroy death and darkness and evil. So when a woman became barren, it was maybe a less of a chance that person was to be born, and maybe God wasn't fulfilling the promises he made to Adam and to Abraham. And so when a woman became barren, it was a very solemn event. And this was due to Israel's barrenness. In Deuteronomy chapters 28, verses 15 through 19, there's this idea that when Israel is not producing fruit, producing what God wants them to, that God will make their people barren. If they do not produce for God, they will not be able to produce. So Judges closes on a story of how how God put people in place to direct Israel, who were supposed to be the Levites. But they were just as corrupt as every other Israelite. That's specifically in Judges 17 and 19. And this picture is continued in 1 Samuel. As Eli cannot discern prayer from drunkenness, he sees Hannah mumbling and she's praying, but because of his spiritual blindness, he accuses her of being drunk versus praying. And that's to show how the Levites in this time period were corrupt. They were spiritually blind, could not hear or see God, as we'll see a little bit later too. As long as spiritually blind people like Eli and his sons were gatekeepers of the temple, Israel was going to be in trouble. More and more women would become barren. God would not produce in them if they would not produce. So, moving on a little bit to Hannah's prayer, which starts in chapter 2. Every prayer should be like Hannah's prayer. It's one of helplessness. It's one of complete humility. It's one of recognizing that God is the only one that can bring fruit. It acknowledges that God is the only one who can open doors, and more specifically, open wombs. So prayer takes place at the temple, which actually wasn't a temple at all. It was a tabernacle. And I'll put a link in the description of what tabernacles look like, but they weren't real temples. That tabernacle had actually been there throughout the period of the Judges. It looks to have first been set up in Joshua chapter 18, verse 1. It had become somewhat of a permanent building. Eli is standing at the doorposts of this temple, which again, you'll look at the pictures and realize it's what that would signify. And just as Sarah stood at the door listening to the three men talk to Abraham, and when she was delivered this news that she would conceive, Israel had to pass through blood-stained door as they came into new birth from slavery in Egypt. So far in the Old Testament, we have this idea that people standing at the door means conception, means that life is coming. So Hannah, not knowing that that's what that would signify, of course, vows to dedicate her son, if God would give her one, as a Nazarite, which means that he would pretty much live as a priest. There are several people in the Old Testament and New Testament who took this Nazarite vow. Samson was one, Samuel would be another, and then John the Baptist. And all three of these guys were born to women who were previously barren. Pretty interesting. There seems to be a pretty big play on the name between Samuel and Saul. So Samuel in Hebrew sounds like this. It's Shemel, if you can say that, Shemel. And it means literally, name is God. And Saul, Sha'al, means asked. To ask someone, but it's not an infinitive like that. It's just asked. So etymologically, and that is how the word is formed, these names are very similar. There seems to be a play when you're going back and forth between Samuel and Saul. The people asked for a Saul, asked for a king, but they already had one asked for, which was Samuel. Samuel was the person they should have been asking for, but instead they asked for Saul. Samuel also could be tied to hearing. The name is heard as God. So in Deuteronomy 6, in Hebrew, that chapter 6 is called the Shema, like Shemel. The Shema is this, dictate from God telling that his word should be told to their children when they're walking about, when they're eating, when they're sleeping. They should love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, and mind. That whole section in Deuteronomy chapter 6 is called the Shema. It's called the hearing, to listen, and you can hear that in Samuel's name, that Shemel. And it's a sign maybe that through Samuel the Lord was raising up a renewed Israel to hear the word of the Lord. So we don't pick that up in our English versions, but in the Hebrew that's there. It's this idea that these all words sound alike and maybe they're context clues. It's pretty cool. So if you want to take a break real quick, you can read 1 Samuel 2, verse 11 through chapter 3, verse 21. And so in this section, we find that Eli is paralleled to Belial, which would have been, again, an Old Testament, like Jesus called Beelzebub. Old Testament idea of demons is that there was kind of this plethora of demonic things and demonic entities that did different things. caused sickness, brought about natural disasters, things like that. And so this is just pretty much another term for Satan. That Eli is compared to Belial. Samuel is contrasted to Eli and his sons. So we're already seeing like a good and bad happening here. So Hophni and Phinehas, which were Eli's sons, committed multiple sins here, and why they are going to be punished further on. But let's look here really closely in what these sins are. Specifically, they're taking the meat sacrifices. They're taking more than was allowed to them. As Levites, as people making the sacrifices, they were able to take some of the meat from the sacrifices brought by the people, but they were taking more than what they were supposed to. So you have this idea of greed being there, and stealing and robbing from the person making the sacrifice. So hopefully it wasn't too confusing. An Israelite comes and brings their ox, their cow, their sheep, whatever it was, their doves, whatever it was. Well, they would give those sacrifices to the Levites, and the Levites would be the one to make the cuts, to actually physically make the sacrifice, but it's on behalf of the Israelite that's bringing the sacrifice. And so since the Levi is doing that, God says, well, since that's your job, you're able to take some of that meat for yourself and for your family. Hophni and Phinehas were taking more than they were allowed. So they're robbing the sacrificer, the one who's bringing the sacrifice, and robbing God in a way. And they're also taking the meat before burning the fat. So after they were making their cuts, they would have to burn the fat along with some of the organs, and that would go up to God. That pleasing aroma was God's sacrifice. And then they would take their meat for them and their families. But they were flipping that order. They were taking what they wanted and then burning whatever else for God. So they were robbing from the sacrificer and robbing from God. On top of that, which you read in chapter 2 and verse 22, they were sleeping with women who served in the tabernacle, which is just, blows your mind. That these men of God who are supposed to be leading the people of Israel in their spirituality were committing these types of acts. It's on the same level as me as a minister sleeping around on my wife. It would be a disgusting act. It would be deplorable. The people who look up to me would be completely, distraught. I can't imagine my youth minister or my preacher when I was growing up if they had committed something like that. It would have been so hard to deal with. But Hophni and Phinehas were just kind of doing this out in the open. It was known that they were sleeping with women in the tabernacle. It was known that they were taking from the sacrifices, and no one was doing anything about it. Israel was spiritually barren, bearing no fruit. In Leviticus 18, sexual sin is uncovering the nakedness. I want to kind of make an allusion here to what this could refer to in some other contexts. So in Leviticus 18, sexual sin is referred to as uncovering the nakedness of someone. Something that Eli's sons were doing to the women who served in the temple, who these women were to remain virgins. To work in the holy temple, you yourself had to remain sexually pure, sexually holy. And in a sense, they violated the women there who were supposed to, in a sense, represent the temple. They were to be holy as the temple was holy. If they weren't holy, they disrespected, deconsecrated the temple and what it was supposed to be. So in violating the temple, in Hophni and Phinehas violating the women, they were violating the temple. They were violating God's house. So Eli's sons were literally violating women and symbolically violating the temple. So there's a whole list of things that Hophni and Phinehas were doing. On the other hand, Samuel is our prime example of leadership and what it should look like, not just in the workplace for us today, but especially in the church today. See, Samuel served Eli faithfully. Eli was clearly corrupt and allowed his sons to continue his corrupt living, and they even went beyond him in a lot of ways. So Samuel served Eli, Eli being one like Belial, an evil person. So Samuel serves Eli despite the evils he had to endure. Samuel did not seize control of Israel once he knew God was on his side. He let God do that. He let God take control there. He focused on serving Yahweh faithfully, even in a doomed an ungodly sanctuary. That's huge. A lot of us want to leave a job because of corrupt people. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. You know your situation better than anybody else. But there is something here I think we could pick up. That Samuel knew his duty, knew what he needed to do, and was willing to do it even when circumstances were not favorable for him. We got to remember that throwing down and setting up pillars is Yahweh's work. It's not ours. We want to kick somebody out of a leadership position because we don't think they're doing good. We don't think they're a good boss. We want to do whatever we can to, take over their position. That's God's business. That goes to Romans 13. We're to obey civil authority. We're not to overthrow the empire. We're supposed to be subject to it. God will tear down pillars when he sees the time is right. If you want to take a break right here too, and go ahead and read chapters 4 verse 1 through chapter 7 and verse 13. So Samuel is actually absent from these last couple of chapters, and it's for literary and theological reasons. Israel didn't seek counsel from the one who hears God. Samuel, we get that, from Samuel hearing God speaking to him at night, but Eli not being able to hear him. Samuel is the one who can hear God, but Israel won't listen to Samuel. So, in a sense, the author takes Samuel out of these couple of chapters to show that Samuel's not to blame here. He's not to blame for what occurs next. It's because the Israelites didn't come to him for advice. Israel hoped this battle would be like Jericho, and you can see that in the fact that they go back to bring in the Ark of the Covenant so they can, they hope that they can win. They make sure that the priests, Hophni and Phinehas, are carrying the Ark in, and they come in shouting to the point where the Philistines are terrified, and they recognize this being the God who led them out of Egypt. So even the Philistines were reminded of Yahweh's power in Egypt. But this battle didn't go like Jericho. It went more like Ai, where they were completely devastated. And so after news comes back that the battle has been lost, news comes to Eli, and Eli hears that Hophni and Phinehas had been killed. But more importantly for him, the Ark of the Covenant had been taken. And so you can see there is still that idea of priority in Eli's mind, that it's only when he hears that the Ark has been taken that he is completely crushed, literally. He falls back, and because we have already read that he is a weighty person, he's a heavy man, he falls back on his head, crushes his neck, and he dies. So, Eli is crushed by the weight as the weight of the Lord leaves Israel. What I mean by that is the word for glory in the Hebrew is the same word for weightiness, for something being heavy. So as the heaviness of Eli crushes him, the heaviness of the Lord, the glory of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, leaves Israel. The dethronement of leaders is not always a bad thing. I'm sure a lot of people were devastated when they heard that Eli died, but it wasn't a bad thing. Even the fall of church leaders is not always a tragedy. It may well be a sign of God's work to renew his people. And that's sometimes really tough to hear. I remember I was really young, and we had a preacher who had preached for us for like a couple of decades, and he decided to move. And the church was devastated. I remember walking through the auditorium after that announcement was made, and people were crying and hugging each other, and it was weird. I didn't understand it. I was young. I was 7 or 8, maybe younger than that. And but that still stuck out to me, how everyone was so crushed at this. And I get that now. I understand. I have moved churches, and I do understand the sadness and the mourning that does come along with that. But that's not necessarily always a bad thing. Maybe God's working there. Maybe God is attempting to renew his people. So the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. And as they come in, they place the Ark of the Covenant in there next to their big statue of Dagon. And they come in the next morning, and the statue has fallen over. Dagon has fallen over, and it looks like it's actually bowing down to the Ark of the Covenant. They come in the next day, and then the next day. And when they came in, I believe it was the third day, the head of the statue had fallen off, and his hands had fallen off. And so what does that necessarily mean? Well, first off, there's a lot of examples of heads in the book of Samuel. Eli's neck is broken, that's a pretty crazy thing. Dagon's head is broken off here. Saul is known as a man who is head and shoulders above all others, and Absalom, who is David's son, is known for his head of hair. This idea that maybe the breaking of the head could relate to crushing of the serpent's head in Genesis 3:15. Every time one of these heads are crushed, Eli, Dagon, Saul, Absalom, it is God crushing evil. It's putting evil away and raising somebody else up who will properly lead. Cutting the hands off or the palms off of the statue could also relate to the fact that the hand of Yahweh was against the Philistines. If you read in chapters 5, verses 6 through 7, verse 9, and verse 11, all four of those verses have the term, the hand of Yahweh was against the Philistines. So it could be relating to there. So, about 20 years later from this incident here with Dagon's statue, Samson would actually be brought into this temple to destroy it, little known to the Philistines. Not only the statue, but the whole temple complex as well. Psalms chapter 78 has a really cool description of the exile of the ark. And it pulls out parallels with the story of Samson. It's pretty cool. So check that out sometime. It's towards the end of the book, like starting in verse 60 or something like that. So they send back the ark because all these plagues have come to the Philistines, and they try tossing it around to different Philistine villages, and more evil and plagues keep coming on them. So they're like, all right, just send it back. What we're going to do is we're going to do this test with these cows. You can read that if you want. So anyway, the cows end up bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Beth Shemesh, which is a town of Levites, hence the really quick reference to Levites coming up to take care of it. But the Levites commit several different sins in handling the ark. You might be really shocked to hear that God kills 70 of those people, of 70 Israelites, because they were messing with the ark. And you might think that's extreme, but let's think about this for a second. First off, they're Levites. They know the Levitical code. They know how they're supposed to be taking care of the ark. They know what God has told them to do, but they're specifically just disobeying it. And this is in several different ways. First, when the ark comes in, they take the cows and they immediately sacrifice them to God as a burnt offering. But Leviticus 1:3 says that all burnt offerings are supposed to only be done with male cows. So there we go, strike one. They're already being hasty in their sacrifices and not doing what God has asked for. Second, they took the ark, set it on a rock, and immediately looked inside. Well, that's the biggest no-no when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant. Numbers chapter 4 and verse 5 says that they should have covered it immediately. They should have thrown something over it so that no one could look on it. Instead, not only did they look on it, but they touched it and then even looked inside of it. Verses 19 through 20 of Numbers chapter 4 go on to say that only the Kohathites, which were the ones that were supposed to look after the ark, they weren't even supposed to look at it, let alone touch it. So these are Levites that are not Kohathites committing these grievous sins. They then tried to get rid of it. I mean, because they were like, which is just like crazy. You had the Ark of the Covenant with you. And because you weren't treating it right, and you suffered consequences for it, you're going to get rid of it. The logic there just doesn't make sense. But anyway, they feared Yahweh. They were scared of what the Ark of the Covenant, the holiness that surrounded it. So they just wanted to get rid of it. So it just goes to show, you act like a Philistine, you act like somebody who is not going to abide God's rules, and God's going to treat you like a Philistine. God's going to treat you like someone who does not love him and is not obedient to him. I think this story is really applicable to you and me. Whenever we see God's justice or discipline in our lives, we usually try to run from it. If we're not running from it, we're complaining about it. We hate to receive any type of discipline, and we hate to see justice when it's brought on us. We beg for it when it comes to someone who's done something evil against us, against our family, but we hate it when justice is brought on us. That's the same thing that's happening here with these Levites in Beth Shemesh. So the ark is sent to Kerith Jearim. which is a Gentile city in the territory of the Gibeonites, from Joshua chapter 9, if you remember that story. The Levites mistreated, like we just read from Beth Shemesh. The Levites mistreated and then rejected the Lord's throne, so the Lord left Beth Shemesh to dwell in a city of Gentile God-fearers until Israel returns to seek her Lord. Pretty cool, pretty crazy that God's going to leave the Israelites because they're not going to take care of them. And so he's going to go and live with the Gentiles. And he's actually with them for several decades. Pretty cool. God shows no favoritism. He completely adheres to, dwells with, fights for, protects those who love him, those who fear him, those who bear fruit for him. So that's our first class for the book of Samuel. I hope it was good. I hope you got something from it. It's got so many cool stories just in these first 7 chapters. So if you didn't get to read them during this class, I hope that you do so later. Again, happy Easter. Give praise to Jesus Christ today because he rose so that you could live. He defeated death so that you never have to die. I miss you all. I hope to see you soon. Continue to show love to your neighbors. Find new ways to serve them through this period of social distancing. Do whatever you can to show Jesus' love. If you got any questions, leave them in the comments. You can message me directly, text me, call me, email me, whatever you got. That's it. Peace and love.